Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I will be looking at how to use aggregate functions and how to use the group by. And all of this will be used in the select statement. So I will start off by explaining what is an aggregate function, and then we will explain how to use some of the different types of aggregate functions, and thereafter I will introduce the use of the group by statement when we are using aggregate functions. As usual, I've been using in this series the table TBL actors that contains these fields, and the records that we are looking at are these 4 records that are contained in the table TBL actors. So what is an aggregate function? Well, this is a function that performs a calculation. The calculation is performed on multiple rows. So some calculation is performed on multiple rows, and you obtain some single value as a result. A possible example that you could be familiar with is in school. When you get your report, you generally asked the question, what is your aggregate? And usually the response is, my aggregate is, you take all the subjects that you've received marks for, you find the average, and you return an answer based on what that average is. So if we look at this particular table and we isolate the annual earnings, then we have something like this. An aggregate in this instance would be, what is the sum of all of these? So once you find the sum of the annual earnings, it will give you a single answer, which is what we call the aggregate, which is the sum of the annual earnings. There are many different types of aggregate functions. In this video, my focus is going to be on these 5 aggregates where we will find the count, which counts up the number of rows, sum up a particular set of rows. We can find the average, the minimum value, and the maximum value. So these are the aggregates that we will be focusing on. Let's look at the syntax. If we want to use an aggregate function, it is used in the select part. And for example, if we are using sum, you will then say select your aggregate function, in this case sum, and then specify the column in which you want the aggregate to work on. And then as usual, from your table name. So this is the compulsory part where the aggregate will then work on all of the rows in that particular table that you're working with. You could also introduce a condition, and remember from the previous video that explained the where clause, the condition will restrict the number of rows. So if you're adding a restriction, then it means that the aggregate is then working on the restricted number of rows that will be returned. Let's go straight into some examples. Display the total number of actors. So if you want to display, in this case, we are going to make use of count, which will display the total number of actors. And we will then say select, there it is. And when you use count in brackets, we normally put in a star, from, and the table name. In this case, we know from the table that we looked at earlier on, we've got 4 actors. So if we had to count the number of rows, that would be 4. And some of you may be thinking, if you watched the very first video, you can make use of an alias. And if you were using an alias, then that heading could be changed to something more appropriate. In the next example, display the total number of actors, which is similar to the previous example, but they must have an annual earning above 100,000. So this is our restriction. So in this case, we will say select count star from TBL actors. And how do we put in a restriction? We make use of the where clause, where annual earnings is greater than 100,000. So this will count up the number of records that have an annual earning greater than 100,000. And in this case, we've got 2 actors that have an annual earning above 100,000. In the next example, we want to display the total annual earnings for all the actors. We want the total. And the aggregate function in this case would be to make use of sum. We would then say select sum. There we are, that's our aggregate. Select sum of what? Sum up the annual earnings. And in this case, here we are. This is our alias. That's our alias from TBL actors. So we're renaming the heading. The heading is going to say total earnings. We're using square brackets, you will recall, because there is a space in our alias. But remember, the focus of this video is on the aggregate function. So it's select sum of the annual earnings, and it's going to return a single row. So the sum of all the annual earnings for all the actors is 369,000 rands. We could then say display the total earnings of all the local actors. Again, we have a restriction. So the restriction is we only want the total earnings for the local actors. So it's similar to what we had in the previous example with a restriction. Select, there it is, aggregate function, sum, annual earnings from TBL actors, and there we are. Where is local equals true. And is local equals true will refer to the local actors in our table. If you've forgotten the field names in the table, I would suggest you go back to the screen that outlines the table structure so you understand exactly what field names are used in the table. And in this case, the total earnings of the local actors, that adds up to 199,000 as compared to 369, which was the total earnings of all the actors. Let's look at another example. Display the average age. Average aggregate function is AVG of all the actors. So we would say select, there it is, aggregate function, the field is age, that's your alias from TBL actors. And we find that the average age of all the actors is 24.5. The next example, display the oldest age and the youngest age. So we need to display 2 values. Oldest would be max, and youngest would be finding the min. And we would then say select max age, and then we have an alias, comma, then there's our min age with an alias. Notice no square brackets for this alias because there's no space, as there is with the previous alias from TBL actors. So if we are to run this SQL statement, we will see that the oldest age is 50 and the youngest age of the actors in this instance is 10 years. So to summarize, what have we done? We've used aggregate functions We've used it on a specific column, and in using it, we got one specific value, which was a summary of that particular column that we were working with, giving one particular answer.